Rain does not fall gently in Seoul. Not in November. It falls like it's being thrown. Min-hee sat on the concrete steps behind Cheonji Tower with a single plastic container balanced on her knees. Inside it, rice. White, plain, going cold in the wind. It was supposed to be her dinner. It was supposed to be her only dinner, because her account had 11,001 left in it and payday was a rumor now, not a date. She had just lost her job 40 minutes ago, in front of 30 guests, over a spilled glass of wine that wasn't even her fault. An old man sat 2 steps down from her, folded into himself the way people fold when the cold gets personal. He was homeless. She could tell from the cardboard flattened beneath him, from the way his hands shook not from age but from hunger. He wasn't asking. He wasn't even looking at her. He had simply stopped existing loudly, the way people do when they've learned that existing loudly gets you removed from places. Min-hee looked at her rice. Then she looked at him. She didn't think about it. That was the strange part. Later, she'd try to explain to herself why she did it, and she'd never find a reason more complicated than, he was hungrier than me. She split the container in half with the edge of the plastic spoon and held it out. It's not much, she said, but it's warm. The old man looked up at her like she'd handed him something with a heartbeat. He didn't say thank you. He just ate, slowly, like a man rationing a memory. Min-hee ate her half looking at the rain, at the tower behind her lit up gold and cruel 30 floors above, at the life she used to have flickering out somewhere on the 12th floor where her locker still had her name tag in it. She did not know that above her, behind one-way glass on the top floor, a man had been watching the security feed of that stairwell for the last 6 minutes. He did not know her name yet. He knew everything else. And what he'd just seen. A woman with nothing giving away half of it without hesitating, without performing it, without looking around to see if anyone would notice. Undid something in him that boardrooms, blades, and 11 years of running Seoul's underworld had never touched. Kang-dae picked up his phone. Find her, he said. Tonight. If you love a slow burn power reversal, the kind where the coldest man in Seoul becomes the warmest thing in her life, hit subscribe right now. Seoul Sauce drops these every week, and trust me, you don't want to miss where this one goes. Drop a cooked rice in the comments if you'd have shared that rice too. 6 hours earlier, Min-hee had still believed in the job. She'd worked at Sky Table, the rooftop restaurant on the 40th floor of Cheonji Tower, for 2 years. It was the kind of restaurant where the napkins cost more than her grocery budget and the clientele tipped in favors instead of cash, because favors were worth more to men like that. She'd started as a hostess. She'd worked her way to floor lead. She was good at it. Good at reading a table, good at disappearing exactly when a couple needed privacy and reappearing exactly when the wine ran low. She was good at it right up until the night director Oh Sang-chul decided he wanted to be better than good at humiliating her. He was the tower's leasing director, a man whose signature could end restaurants, and he knew it. He'd been drinking since 6. By 9, he'd started narrating Min-hee's every move to his table of investors like she was an exhibit. Watch this, he told them, loud enough for 3 tables to hear. Watch how she walks like she thinks she belongs on this floor. Min-hee kept her spine straight and her tray steady. She'd survived worse men saying worse things. You learned, in this job, that silence was armor. But Director O wanted a reaction. So when she leaned to refill his glass, he moved his arm. Not by accident, everyone at the table saw it. No one at the table would ever admit it. And the burgundy went down the front of his 300,001 shirt and across the white tablecloth like a wound opening. The silence that followed had a texture to it. Metallic. Final. She did that on purpose, Director O said, standing, his voice climbing into performance. Get her out. Get her out of my building. The floor manager appeared within 90 seconds. Tower staff always appeared fast when a director raised his voice, and Min-hee was walked to the service elevator without her jacket, without her final paycheck processed, without a single person at that table looking her in the eye. I'm sorry, the floor manager said. And he did look sorry, which almost made it worse. You know how it is. He signs the building's lease renewals. I know how it is, Min-hee said. She rode the service elevator down 40 floors in her work uniform, soaked in wine that wasn't hers, and stepped out into November rain with a plastic container of rice she'd packed that morning for her own dinner. because dinner had become something she planned for rather than something she simply had. She sat on the concrete steps behind the tower because it was the only place the wind didn't reach her directly. That's where she found the old man. That's where she found herself without meaning to, still being the kind of person who shares. To understand what happened next, you have to understand what Kang Dae actually was. Not a businessman who dabbled in crime. Not a gangster who'd bought his way into legitimacy. Kang Dae was something rarer and colder. A man who had built an empire specifically so he'd never again have to ask anyone for anything. He owned Changi Tower outright, though his name appeared on none of the paperwork. He owned 6 other towers under 6 other names. He controlled the port authority in 3 cities through men who believed they controlled themselves. He had not raised his voice in a business meeting in 9 years, because he had learned early that silence terrified people more efficiently than shouting ever could. His organization called him the Winter Line, because that was the temperature at which he operated, precise, unbothered, and absolutely final once decided. He lived on the top floor of the tower he'd built, in rooms that had no photographs, no warmth, no evidence that a life was being lived in them at all. He watched the city below him the way a surgeon watches an X-ray, for weakness, for structure, for the fastest path to correction. He had installed the stairwell cameras behind the tower himself years ago, after a rival had tried to have him ambushed on that exact concrete. Since then, the feed ran constantly on a monitor in the corner of his office, background noise to a man who trusted nothing that wasn't under his own eyes. Which is how he came to be watching, at 9:47 p.m., when a woman in a stained server's uniform sat down on those steps like the wind had personally targeted her, and split her only meal in half for a stranger who could give her nothing back. Kang Dae had watched thousands of people cross that stairwell. Executives cutting through to avoid press. Couriers. Once, a rival's man who never made it to the street. He had never once paused the feed. He paused it now. He watched her hand the container over without ceremony. He watched her not look around for witnesses, not perform kindness for an audience, not hesitate the way people hesitate when generosity is costing them something they can't actually afford to lose. Kang Dae had 11 men who owed him their lives and would not have made that choice. "Who is she?" he said to the empty room, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he wanted an answer to a question that had nothing to do with money, territory, or blood. Quick gut check before we go further. Comment below. Have you ever given away something you desperately needed, just because someone else needed it more? I read every single one of these. Let's see how many good hearts are watching this tonight. By midnight, Kang Dae had a folder on his desk with Min-hee's entire life reduced to 11 pages. Kim Min-hee, 27. Born in Incheon, orphaned at 9 when her parents died in a factory fire that the company later settled for an amount that covered a funeral and nothing else. Raised by an aunt who resented the extra mouth and made sure Min-hee knew it. Worked through university on 3 part-time jobs. Graduated with a hospitality degree she'd never gotten to use properly because entry-level positions in the industry she trained for required connections she'd never had time to build while she was busy surviving. 2 years at Sky Table. No debts beyond a modest student loan she'd been chipping at for 6 years. No family to call. A landlord who'd raised her rent twice in 18 months. A single photograph on her apartment wall, based on the security sweep his people had done of the building lobby. A photograph of parents she barely remembered, kept anyway, because some things you keep not because you remember them but because forgetting them would be worse. Terminated tonight. Effective immediately. No severance. Because Director O had classified it as gross misconduct in the internal system before she'd even reached the ground floor. Kang Dae read the file twice. He did not read files twice. He was a man who processed information once, filed it, and acted. But something about the shape of her life, the specific, quiet dignity of a woman who had been given nothing and had still found something to give, made him want to understand the mechanism of it before he decided what to do. He picked up his phone and called the one person in his organization who still spoke to him like a human being instead of a weather system. "Ji-hoon," he said. "I want everything on Director Oh Sang-chul. Every deal, every debt, every mistress, every offshore account. By morning." "Can I ask why, sir?" Kang Dae looked at the paused frame on his monitor. A woman in a wet uniform, holding out half a meal to a man who had nothing to offer her in return. "No," Kang Dae said. "You can't. Min-hee didn't know any of this. She only knew that the next morning, her phone rang with a number she didn't recognize, and a calm, unhurried voice on the other end said, "Miss Kim Min-hee, I'm calling on behalf of a private hospitality group. We understand you're currently between positions. We'd like to offer you an interview." Min-hee sat up in bed, the borrowed blanket still smelling faintly of last night's rain, and stared at the phone like it might explain itself if she waited long enough. She had applied to exactly nothing yet. It was barely 8 in the morning. The termination hadn't even processed in the system. She almost didn't answer. Calls like this were common enough, preying on people freshly unemployed. But something about the caller's precision. He had her full name, her exact job title, the exact date she'd been let go, made her stomach tighten with a feeling she couldn't name yet. "Who gave you my information?" she asked. "A mutual admirer of good character," the voice said, and hung up before she could ask what that meant. The interview was set for that evening, at a private dining room on the second floor of a building she'd never heard of, Woobin House, a quiet, unmarked establishment 3 blocks from Cheonji Tower that, unbeknownst to her, functioned as one of Kangdae's few social outposts, a place where he occasionally conducted the human parts of his business that his tower couldn't hold. She arrived in the only interview-appropriate clothes she owned, a blazer 2 years out of style, her resume printed on paper she'd had to borrow money from a friend to buy. She was nervous in the specific way of someone who has learned that nervousness is a luxury she can't afford to show. The man who greeted her at the door was not what she expected from a hospitality group representative. He wore no name tag, no branded lanyard, nothing that told her who he worked for. He was tall, unreasonably still, dressed in black that had clearly never been bought off a rack. His eyes did the thing eyes do when they've made a decision about you already and are simply waiting for you to catch up. "Miss Kim," he said, "thank you for coming on short notice." "You didn't give me a company name," she said, because 2 years of reading difficult men across dinner tables had taught her not to let politeness override instinct. "No," he agreed, "I didn't." "Why not?" "Because I wanted you to come for the opportunity, not the name attached to it." He gestured to a chair. "Please, sit. Eat something first. We can discuss business after." There was a full meal already on the table. Not ostentatious, not designed to overwhelm her, just warm, plain, well-made food. Rice among it. Min-hee looked at the rice and felt something crack quietly in her chest, though she couldn't have explained why. "You look at rice like it means something to you," the man said. "It does," she said, before she could decide whether that was safe to admit. "Last night I gave half my dinner to a stranger. It was the only thing I had left to give. I don't even know why I'm telling you this." Something moved across the man's face, so brief she almost missed it, but she'd spent 2 years reading exactly this kind of face for exactly this kind of flicker, and what she saw was not surprise. It was recognition. "I know," he said quietly. Min-hee went still. "How could you possibly know that?" "Because I saw you do it," Kangdae said. "From my window. Last night, on the stairwell behind Cheonji Tower. This is where it gets good, so if you're new here, subscribe now because the next 20 minutes are the reason this channel exists. And drop a comment telling me, would you have trusted a stranger who admitted to watching you first? I want to know where your line is." Min-hee's chair scraped back an inch before she caught herself. "You were watching me? I have cameras on that stairwell," Kangdae said, unbothered by her alarm, which somehow made it less alarming and more unsettling at the same time. "I own the building. I watch the feed. Most nights, nothing happens on it worth remembering. Last night, something did. That's not a normal thing to say to someone." "I'm not a normal man," Kangdae said. "I decided a long time ago I'd rather be honest and unsettling than smooth and false. You can leave right now if you'd like. I won't stop you, and there will be no consequence to you for leaving." Min-hee should have left. Every instinct that had kept her safe through a childhood with no safety net told her to stand up and walk out of a private dining room with a man who admitted to surveilling her and didn't seem to think that was strange. But there was something underneath his stillness that didn't match the danger her instincts were flagging. He wasn't performing calm to disarm her. He simply was calm, The way people are who have spent years removing every unpredictable variable from their lives. Except, apparently, her. "Who are you?" she asked instead of leaving. "My name is Kangdae. I run several businesses in this city. Some of them you would recognize. Some of them you wouldn't want to." "That's not an answer. It's the only one I'm giving you tonight," he said. "What I can tell you is this. I watched you give away half your only meal to a man who could do nothing for you in return, on the worst night of your recent life, without hesitating and without wanting credit for it. I have met perhaps 3 people in 11 years who would have done what you did without an audience to perform it for." Min-hee felt her throat tighten. Nobody had described her like that before, not with admiration exactly, but with the specific attention of someone who had actually looked. "I did lose my job," she admitted. "Yesterday. Over nothing. Over a rich man's tantrum." "Director Oh Sang-chul," Kangdae said. Min-hee's blood went cold. "How do you?" "I know a great deal about the people who operate in my buildings," he said simply. "He terminated you without severance and falsified the reason as gross misconduct, which will follow you if you try to find another position in this industry." "You looked into my termination." "I looked into everything about you," Kangdae said, with no apology in his voice, only fact. "I find that I don't regret it." "I want to offer you a position," Kangdae said, and for the first time in the conversation, his voice shifted, not softer, exactly, but more deliberate, like a man choosing each word for weight rather than speed. "Managing the private dining operations across 3 properties I own. Full authority over staffing, over service standards, over the exact kind of men who think a spilled glass of wine gives them permission to destroy someone's life." "You would answer only to me." Min-hee laughed, short and disbelieving. "You're offering me a director-level position based on watching me give away rice on a security camera. I'm offering you a director-level position because 2 years of managing a floor at Skytable under conditions I've now reviewed in detail tells me you're extraordinarily good at your job, and the incident with Director O tells me you have a spine most people in this industry sold years ago," Kangdae said. "The rice is simply what made me look in the first place. And if I say no, then I'll have Ji-hoon drive you home, and you won't hear from me again, and I'll make sure Director O's falsified termination record is quietly corrected, so it doesn't follow you into your next interview," Kangdae said. "There's no cost to declining. I don't operate that way." That, more than anything else, was what made Min-hee believe him, because every predator she'd ever encountered in this industry had made their offers cost something if you refused. This was the first time a powerful man had told her the door stayed open either way. "Why would you fix my termination record if I say no to the job?" "Because it was corrected the moment I confirmed the reason was a lie," Kangdae said. "That was never conditional on your answer." Min-hee sat with that for a long moment, watching a man who ran unnamed businesses across a city eat rice like it was the most ordinary thing in the world, having apparently already dismantled a rich man's lie about her before she'd even walked in the door. "Who are you really?" she asked again, quieter this time. "Someone who's about to become very complicated for you," Kangdae said. "I'd rather you know that now than find out later and feel deceived." "Okay, but who says that to someone on a first meeting?" Tell me in the comments if this is the most honest red flag you've ever heard, and smash that like button if you're already Team Kangdae. Soul Sauce back after this. Min-hee took the job. Not because she trusted him completely. She didn't, not yet, and she told him so plainly, which seemed to please him more than it should have, but because the alternative was 6 more months of applying to positions with a falsified black mark on her record, in an industry small enough that everyone would eventually hear Director O's version of events before they heard hers. Her first week running the private dining floor at Woobin House was unlike anything she'd experienced at Skytable. The clientele was quieter, stranger, more careful. Men who tipped generously and spoke rarely, who never raised their voices, who treated every staff member with a formal courtesy that felt less like manners and more like discipline. She began to understand, slowly, in the way you understand a fire is nearby before you see the flames, that these were not ordinary businessmen. "You run a very unusual restaurant," she said to Kangdae on the 4th night, after closing, when he'd taken to appearing in the private dining room after service like it had become a habit neither of them had named yet. "I run a very unusual business," he said. The restaurant is a small part of it. Are you going to tell me what the rest of it is? Eventually, Kangdae said. When I'm certain telling you won't cost me the only thing about this arrangement I actually want to keep. Which is? He looked at her for a long moment, the particular stillness she was starting to recognize as his version of vulnerability, the way other men fidgeted or looked away. He simply held eye contact a half-second longer than comfort allowed. You not looking at me the way everyone else in this city looks at me, he said. Min-hee didn't have an answer for that, so she poured him tea instead, the way she'd have done for anyone at the end of a long shift, and he accepted it with something that looked, on his face, dangerously close to gratitude. 2 weeks in, Min-hee mentioned, offhand, exhausted, half to herself while restocking the pass, that she hadn't had a proper birthday celebration since she was 19. The last year her aunt had still bothered to acknowledge the date before formally washing her hands of any remaining obligation. She didn't think Kangdae had been listening. He'd been across the room, reviewing invoices with the particular focus of a man who trusted numbers more than people. 3 weeks later, on the exact date, which she hadn't repeated to him, which existed nowhere in any file he could have pulled, which she'd mentioned exactly once in a tired, unguarded sentence he shouldn't have had any reason to retain. She arrived at Woobin House to find the private dining room closed to clients for the evening, a single table set, and a small, unpretentious cake sitting in the center of it. You remembered, she said, and her voice did something she hadn't planned for it to do. I remember everything you say, Kangdae said, like it was an unremarkable fact and not the single most disarming thing anyone had done for her in 8 years. It's a professional habit. I apologize if it's strange. It's not strange, Min-hee said. It's the first time in 8 years someone's remembered without me reminding them. Then I'm glad I did, Kangdae said. And for once, he didn't retreat into stillness after saying something honest. He let her see exactly how much it mattered to him that she'd noticed. That was the night Min-hee understood she was no longer simply working for a strange, powerful man out of necessity. Something else had taken root, quiet and unplanned, in the space between his surveillance-honest confessions and his surgical, specific tenderness. She still didn't know what he actually did in the other 11 hours of his day. She was starting to realize she wanted to know anyway. If he remembers everything I say, just hit you in a soft spot, you are not alone. The comment section on our last video was flooded with this. Like this video if proof of memory is your love language too. And stick around, because this is the calm before the storm. There was a room on the top floor of Cheonji Tower that no one but Kangdae had entered in 6 years. Not Jihoon. Not the cleaning staff who were paid triple to leave it exactly as it was. Not a single one of the 11 men who owed him their lives. He brought Min-hee there on the 7th week, without explanation, simply unlocking a door she'd assumed was a supply closet and stepping back to let her enter first. Inside was a small room with a single window, a narrow bed that had clearly never been slept in, and a wall of undeveloped photographs. Dozens of them, curling slightly with age, never printed properly, never framed. This was my mother's room, Kangdae said, standing in the doorway like a man unsure if he was allowed to follow her in. Before the tower was mine. Before it was anyone's business tower at all, it was an apartment building, and this was the room she raised me in. Min-hee turned to look at him. You built an empire on top of your childhood home. I built an empire because of what happened in this room, Kangdae said. My mother worked 3 jobs to keep this apartment. When I was 12, our landlord decided he wanted the building for something more profitable, and he had us removed with 4 days' notice and no compensation, because he could, because we had no lawyer and no name and no power to stop him. That's why you own everything now, Min-hee said quietly. So no one can ever do that to you again. So no one can ever do that to anyone I've decided to protect. Again, Kangdae corrected. I bought this building back 11 years later. I kept this room exactly as it was. I have never let anyone inside it, because it's the only proof I still have that I was someone before I became this. Min-hee walked to the wall of photographs and looked closer. They were undeveloped rolls of film, dozens of them, never processed. Why did you never develop these? Because as long as they're undeveloped, I can imagine they show whatever I need them to show, Kangdae said. My mother, laughing. This room, warm. A version of my childhood I only half remember and am afraid to confirm was smaller and sadder than I've let myself believe. You could develop them now, Min-hee said. You don't have to be afraid of them alone anymore. Kang-dae looked at her the way a man looks at a door he spent 11 years welding shut, watching someone else find the seam in it without even trying. Would you stay if I did? I'd stay, Min-hee said. For whatever's actually in them, good or bad. That's the whole point of not being alone with it anymore. They developed 6 roles that night. In a makeshift darkroom Kang-dae's people set up within the hour because he apparently could not be told no once he'd decided something mattered. Most of the photographs were unremarkable. A woman at a stove, a boy doing homework at a small table, ordinary domestic nothing. But in the last role, there was a photograph of that same woman, laughing, holding out half a bowl of rice to a neighbor's child who had none. Kang-dae stared at it for a long time. I forgot she used to do that, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I forgot that's where I actually learned what mattered. Before I let this city teach me something colder instead. That's not something you unlearn, Min-hee said, standing beside him. It's something you buried. There's a difference. I think I just watched you dig it back up. Peace in Min-hee's life had always been a temporary condition. She should have known better than to relax into 6 good weeks. Director Oh Sang-chul had not forgotten her. Men like him rarely forgot the staff they'd humiliated, mostly because forgetting would require acknowledging they'd done something worth remembering. What he'd heard, through the small, incestuous gossip network of Seoul's hospitality elite, was that the waitress he had fired was now running private dining operations for an unnamed but clearly well-funded new group, and that this new group had somehow, quietly, made his falsified termination report simply vanish from the industry's shared blacklist database. That was unacceptable to him. Not because he cared about Min-hee specifically, but because her quiet rise offended his sense of hierarchy. The idea that a woman he'd publicly destroyed could simply reappear, employed, unbothered, and apparently untouchable. He began making calls. Director Oh had connections of his own. Not Kang-dae's caliber, nothing close, but enough mid-tier corporate muscle and enough leverage over 3 other tower directors to make Min-hee's professional life difficult in small, deniable ways. A vendor contract quietly cancelled. A liquor license inspection scheduled with unusual urgency. A rumor, seeded carefully among suppliers, that the new dining group at Woobin House had quality control issues traceable directly to its floor manager. It was corporate warfare, small and cowardly, the kind waged by men who'd never had to be brave a day in their lives because money had always been brave for them. Min-hee noticed it first as a strange delay in a produced delivery, then as a cancelled reservation from a regular client who wouldn't explain why, then as a call from her old university placement office, gently informing her that a concerned party had raised questions about her employment history that they felt obligated to look into. She recognized the shape of it immediately, because she'd spent 2 years learning exactly how men like Director Oh moved when they were angry but too cowardly to confront her directly. She told Kang-dae everything because 6 weeks in, she'd learned that the one thing that actually made him dangerous to be around wasn't his temper. She'd never seen him raise his voice. It was what happened to the people who tried to hurt someone he'd decided to protect. I can handle this myself, she said, even as she told him. I'm not asking you to fix it. I know you're not asking, Kang-dae said, setting down the report she'd handed him with a stillness that felt, for the first time since she'd met him, genuinely cold. I'm choosing to anyway. What Min-hee did not fully understand, what she would only understand in the days that followed, was that Kang-dae's calm was not the absence of anger. It was anger refined into something with no wasted motion at all. He did not shout. He did not threaten. He made 3 phone calls that night, each lasting under 90 seconds, and by morning, the machinery of Director Oh Sang-chul's carefully protected life had begun, quietly and irreversibly, to come apart. Ji-hoon had spent 3 weeks compiling the file Kang-dae requested the very first night he'd seen Min-hee on that stairwell, and it turned out Director Oh's life was, structurally, a house built entirely on debts he'd hidden and favors he'd never actually earned. He'd financed his position at Chonji Tower's leasing office through a loan from a shell company that, unbeknownst to him, Kang-dae had quietly acquired 18 months earlier as part of an unrelated portfolio consolidation. He'd been skimming commission on lease renewals for years, funneling the difference into an offshore account registered under his mistress's sister's name. A detail so specifically embarrassing that even his own lawyers, once informed, would refuse to touch his defense. Kang Dae did not need to invent a single lie to destroy him. He simply needed to stop protecting the ones Director Oh had already told. The first domino was the shell company calling in its loan in full, with a 96-hour notice period that Director Oh's own signed contract, which he'd never read closely, because rich men rarely read the documents that will eventually ruin them, technically permitted. The second domino was an anonymous, entirely factual tip to the tower's board of directors regarding commission discrepancies on the last 4 years of lease renewals, delivered with documentation so precise it left no room for the usual corporate mercy of internal review. The third domino, delivered personally, was Kang Dae himself. We are about to watch a mafia boss dismantle a corporate bully with nothing but paperwork and patience. If you live for this kind of retribution arc, comment Winterline below and let's see how many of you catch what that name means before I explain it. Let's go. Director Oh Sang-chul had never met the man who owned Chonji Tower's true holding structure, because he had never needed to. Leasing directors dealt with property management firms, not the silent capital behind them. So when his assistant told him a Mr. Kang Dae had arrived without an appointment and was already seated in his office, Director Oh's first instinct was mild irritation, not fear. That changed within 4 minutes. Director Oh, Kang Dae said, not standing, not raising his voice, simply existing in the chair across from him with the specific gravity of a man who had already won and was merely allowing the other party the dignity of finding out slowly. I own the holding company that financed your leasing position 8 years ago. I also own the property management group that oversees your commission structure. And, as of this morning, I own the loan currently coming due on your primary residence. Director Oh's face went through several stages of color before settling on something close to gray. I don't understand what this. You terminated a member of staff 2 months ago, Kang Dae continued, as though Director Oh hadn't spoken. Over a spilled glass of wine you caused yourself, and you falsified the reason as gross misconduct to protect your own reputation at her expense. That waitress? This is about a waitress. Her name is Kim Min-hee, Kang Dae said, and something in his voice, for the first time in the conversation, dropped several degrees. And in the last 3 weeks, you have attempted to sabotage her employment no fewer than 4 times, using corporate leverage you believed was untraceable. I don't know what you think you. I don't think, Kang Dae said. I know. I know about the shell loan. I know about the commission skimming. I know about the account under your mistress's sister's name, which, I'll note, is remarkably easy to trace once someone actually looks. You have built an entire life on the assumption that no one with real power would ever bother looking closely at a man as small as you. Director Oh's hands had started to shake, the exact tremor he had watched in a different man on a different set of concrete steps 2 months earlier, the universal physical language of someone realizing, too late, how little control they'd actually had. What do you want? Director Oh finally managed. I want you to understand something before you lose everything you've built on lies, Kang Dae said, standing now, buttoning his jacket with unhurried precision. The woman you humiliated in front of 30 guests gave away her last meal to a stranger on the same night you destroyed her livelihood over a stain on your shirt. You will never, in your entire life, be capable of an act that decent. And you are about to lose your house, your position, and your reputation to a man you've never heard of, because you decided her dignity was a cost you were allowed to spend without consequence. He walked to the door, then paused. The loan calls in Friday, he said. I'd start making arrangements. Director Oh sat frozen in his chair long after the door had closed, staring at the space where the calm, terrifying man had been, replaying every deal he'd ever thought was safely buried, every signature he'd never bothered to read twice, every year he'd spent believing that men without visible power simply didn't have any. It would be 3 more days before he understood exactly how wrong that belief had been. And by then, there would be nothing left for him to do but watch it happen. Word moves fast in towers built on reputation. By the following week, Director Oh Sang-chul's world had folded in on itself with the specific, humiliating speed reserved for men who'd spent their whole careers believing consequences were things that happened to other people. The board, presented with documented commission fraud, terminated him within 72 hours, a termination processed with a kind of poetic precision Min he would later find almost unbearably satisfying, as gross misconduct, effective immediately, no severance. His wife filed for divorce the same week his mistress's account was frozen pending investigation, the two women discovering each other's existence through the same court filing, a coincidence that felt, to anyone who knew Kangdae's methods, considerably less coincidental than it appeared. The loan called in Friday exactly as promised. Director O did not have the liquidity to cover it. His house, the one he'd bought specifically to look down on the kind of people he used to be, went into foreclosure proceedings within the month. The country club that had once fought for his membership quietly rescinded it. The investors who had raised their glasses to him at Skytable stopped returning his calls within a week, the way money always does when it senses a losing hand before the loser himself has finished admitting it. Min he heard about all of it secondhand, the way most of Seoul's hospitality world heard about it. As gossip, as a cautionary tale whispered between service shifts, as proof that the universe occasionally settled its accounts on a schedule you couldn't predict. She confronted Kangdae about it directly, because 6 weeks of working for him had taught her that whatever else he was, he respected being asked to his face more than he respected being avoided. "You did all of that because of me," she said. "It wasn't a question. I did all of that because he humiliated you, lied about you, and then tried to destroy you a second time when you dared to survive the first attempt," Kangdae said. "I would do it again tomorrow." "That's not justice, Kangdae. That's terrifying, honestly. You dismantled a man's entire life." "He dismantled yours first," Kangdae said. "And yours didn't have a shell company loan and an offshore account cushioning the fall." Min-hee sat with that, watching him watch her, waiting, she realized, to see if what he'd done would finally be the thing that made her look at him the way everyone else in this city looked at him. Afraid. Calculating. Gone. "I'm not scared of you," she said finally, and meant it, though she could feel the ground shifting under the sentence even as she said it. "I'm scared of how much I understand why you did it." "That's the most honest thing anyone said to me in 11 years, Kangdae said quietly. "If you're getting chills right now, comment, 'She understands him,' and let's see this thread blow up. And please, subscribe if you haven't, because part 2 of the story is coming, and you do not want to miss what happens after this confession." Back to the story. There was a version of this story where Min-hee simply accepted the retribution and let it settle into the background of a life getting quietly better. That was not the woman Kangdae had fallen for, and it was not the woman who showed up at his office 3 days later with a request instead of a thank you. "I want to use some of what you took from him to help the people he actually hurt," she said, standing in the doorway of the top-floor office she'd never been invited into before, the one with no photographs and no evidence of a life. Not the board. Not the shareholders. The staff. The ones who got written up for things that weren't their fault because he needed someone to blame. The ones who are still working under directors just like him in towers you don't own yet. Kangdae looked at her for a long moment. The particular stillness that she now understood wasn't coldness at all. It was the way he processed feeling something too large to display immediately. "You want to build something," he said. "I want to build a fund," Min-hee said. "A legal defense and severance fund for hospitality staff who get falsified terminations like mine. Something that exists whether or not you're personally watching a stairwell camera the night it happens. Something that doesn't depend on luck." "That will cost money," Kangdae said. "You have money. It will also require my name attached to something legitimate, traceable, and public," Kangdae said. "Which is not a small thing for a man like me to agree to." "I'm not asking you to be a different man," Min-hee said. "I'm asking the man who remembered my birthday without being told to remember that the reason he watched that stairwell footage twice was because decency mattered to him too. Once, before he built an empire that made it dangerous to show it." Kangdae was quiet for a long time. "Draft the proposal," he finally said. "I'll fund it under my own name. No shell company. No hiding." Min-hee felt something in her chest that she hadn't let herself feel in 8 years. The specific, dangerous warmth of being not just protected, but changed by someone as much as she was changing him. "Why now?" she asked. "Why say yes to something with your actual name on it?" "Because you gave away your last meal to a stranger who could give you nothing back," Kangdae said. And I've spent 11 years building an empire designed entirely around never needing to be that person. I'd like to remember, before it's too late, what it felt like. The fund's first case arrived within a week of launch, before either of them had fully believed it was real. Her name was Eugene, 19 years old, a server at a mid-tier hotel restaurant 3 blocks from Changi Tower, terminated the same way Min Hee had been. Falsely accused, blamed for a manager's mistake, fired without severance and with a note in the industry blacklist database that would have followed her for years. She came to the fund's small office, a converted corner of Woobin House, nothing grand, just a desk and a phone line and Min Hee's name on the door. Shaking the same way Min Hee remembered shaking, holding a folder of pay stubs like evidence she wasn't sure anyone would actually look at. "I heard you help people like me," Eugene said. "I didn't believe it was real until I was already outside the door." "I know exactly what that disbelief feels like," Min Hee said, and meant it in a way that made Eugene's shoulders drop half an inch. The specific relief of being believed by someone who wasn't performing sympathy for an audience. "Sit down. Tell me everything. We're gonna fix your record, and then we're gonna make sure the manager who did this can't do it to the next girl." It took the fund's lawyer 4 days to have Eugene's blacklist entry formally corrected, and another 2 weeks to negotiate a settlement from the hotel that covered 3 months of lost wages. Money the hotel paid quietly and quickly, once informed exactly whose fund was asking. Eugene cried in the office the day the settlement came through, not from the money, she said, but from the simple, unfamiliar fact of someone with actual power deciding her humiliation mattered enough to correct. "You did that," Kangdae said to Min Hee that night, watching her count the small, real, unglamorous cases stacking up on her desk. 11 now, in the fund's first month, 11 people whose falsified terminations had been quietly reversed, whose stolen wages had been quietly returned. "Not me. My money paid for the lawyers. But you built the thing that actually reaches people before their lives fall apart the way yours almost did." "We built it," Min Hee corrected. "You said yes to something with your name on it, knowing exactly what that would cost you." "I don't forget things either, Kangdae. That's not a small thing you did." He didn't have an answer for that. He simply reached over and took her hand across the small, unglamorous desk, in a room with real problems instead of stolen millions, and understood, more clearly than he had in 11 years of building an empire, exactly what kind of power was actually worth having. This right here, an 11-year-old empire finally being used for something good, is why I keep making these stories. If Eugene's case moved you even a little, drop a red heart below, and let's push this video past our last upload. Every share genuinely helps this channel keep telling stories like this one. Nothing this good, in a city like Seoul, goes unnoticed by the people it threatens. Kangdae attaching his real name to a public hospitality worker fund was, to the rest of the city's underworld, an earthquake disguised as a press release. Men who had spent a decade fearing the winter line specifically because he was untraceable now watched him voluntarily step into daylight for a woman none of them had heard of 2 months earlier. Rival factions took note. A man that visible was, for the first time in 11 years, a man with something they could actually locate. Min Hee didn't know this yet. She only knew that the week the fund launched, with a modest public announcement, her name listed as director, his listed as founding benefactor, Kangdae had started arriving at Woobin House later than usual, distracted in a way she'd never seen from him, checking his phone with the specific tension of a man managing a fire he hadn't mentioned to her yet. "Something's wrong," she said on the 3rd night of it. "You don't get distracted. That's the one thing about you I've been able to count on since day one." "It's business," Kangdae said. "Nothing you need to carry." "That's what you said about Director O, right before you dismantled his entire life on my behalf," Min Hee said. "I don't think 'nothing you need to carry' is a phrase I'm allowed to trust anymore, coming from you." Kangdae set down his phone. For the first time since she'd met him, he looked, briefly, like a man out of his depth. "There are people in this city who preferred me invisible," he admitted. "Attaching my name to something public, something good, has made me a target in a way 11 years of ruthlessness never did. It's easier to hate a shadow. It's easier to attack a man once he's stepped into the light." Min Hee felt the ground shift again, the way it kept shifting every time she learned one more true thing about him. "Then step back into the shadow," she said quietly. I don't need the fund to have your name on it. I just needed you to say yes. No, Kangdae said, and for the first time, she heard something in his voice that wasn't calculation at all. It was resolve, plain and unguarded. I've spent 11 years being safe because I was invisible. I would rather be in danger and be someone worth being seen as. You taught me that whether you meant to or not. I am not okay right now. Comment below if this line got you too. And listen, if you want to see how this danger plays out, make sure you're subscribed, because this is exactly the moment these stories tend to turn. Soul Sauce, stay with me. The threat, when it came, was not subtle, because the men who sent it wanted Kangdae to know exactly whose hand it was. A rival faction, the Beck family, longtime silent competitors for control of the Port Authority contracts Kangdae had quietly dominated for years, sent a message the only way men like that knew how to send one that couldn't be ignored. They targeted the fund's launch event, a modest public gathering of hospitality workers and press at Woobin House, with a bomb threat called in 20 minutes before doors opened. It was, Ji-hoon would later explain to Min-hee, never actually intended to detonate anything. It was intended to be found, a device disabled just enough to be discovered by security, planted specifically to demonstrate one thing. We know where you are now and we know who matters to you. Min-hee found out only because she was already inside the building when the sweep began, and she watched Kangdae's face change in a way she'd never seen. Not fear for himself, she realized, watching him direct his security team with brutal, controlled efficiency, but something closer to the specific fury of a man watching a threat aimed at something he'd only just allowed himself to want. You need to leave the building, he told her. His voice flat in a way that frightened her more than shouting would have. Not without you. Min-hee. He said her name the way he'd never said it before, not with the calculated stillness she'd grown used to, but with something raw underneath it. This is exactly what I was afraid of. This is the cost of what I let myself become for you. I need you safe right now, more than I need anything else in this city. And I need you to understand, Min-hee said, standing her ground even as security moved around them, that I didn't fall for a man who disappears into shadows the second something threatens him. I fell for the version of you who walked into Director O's office and told him exactly who he was dealing with. Don't you dare become smaller than that now, for my sake. The device was cleared. No one was hurt, but something had changed. A line had been crossed that neither of them could pretend hadn't been crossed, and Kangdae, for the first time since Min-hee had met him, looked like a man who understood that loving her had made him vulnerable in a way his empire never had. This isn't over, he said quietly, watching his security team bag the device for disposal. The Beck family just told me they know exactly where to hurt me, and I just told them, by staying, that they were right. There was a version of this story where Min-hee, faced with real danger for the first time, walked away, where the sensible, self-protective instinct that had kept her alive through an orphan childhood and a decade of surviving powerful, careless men finally won out, and she quietly disappeared back into the anonymous safety of an ordinary life. That was not the choice she made. I'm not leaving, she told Kangdae that night, in the private dining room where all of this had started, the rice from her interview dinner still, somehow, the truest thing either of them had ever offered the other. You didn't ask me to be safe when you found me on that stairwell. You saw someone giving away what little she had and you decided that mattered more than staying hidden. I'm not going to ask you to be smaller now, and I'm not going to make myself smaller either. The Beck family will come at you specifically now, Kangdae said. Not the fund. Not the business. You. Because they've learned that hurting you hurts me more than any amount of money or territory ever could. Then teach me what I need to know to be safe standing next to you, Min-hee said. Don't hide me away like something breakable. I've survived worse than a bomb threat with less protection than I have now. Kangdae looked at her for a long time, the stillness she'd learned to read as his deepest form of feeling, and something in his face finally, fully broke open. I built an empire so I'd never have to need anyone, he said. And somehow, the one time I let myself want something instead of simply taking it, I found the one person in this city brave enough to want me back despite exactly what that costs. I'm not scared of the cost, Min-hee said. I've spent my whole life with nothing to lose. Now I have something worth defending. That doesn't make me weaker, Kangdae. It makes me exactly the kind of person who shares her last bowl of rice with a stranger. and doesn't regret it, even when the world tries to make her. He reached for her hand, the first time he'd initiated any contact between them since the night she'd walked into that dining room, weary and soaked and unemployed, and held it like a man finally allowing himself to need something back. "Then we faced the Beck family together," he said. "Not as my liability, as the reason I remembered how to be a person worth protecting. And that is where we're going to leave it tonight, because if I told you what happens with the Beck family next, you'd never come back for part 2, and I refuse to do that to you." Comment part 2 right now if you need to know how this war ends. Subscribe, hit that bell, and I promise you, the next chapter of this story is even bigger than this one. Soul Sauce will see you very, very soon. The second message from the Beck family did not come as a device this time. It came as a photograph, delivered by courier to Woobin House the following morning, addressed to Kang Dae personally. It was a photograph of Min Hee, taken from across the street outside her apartment building, timestamped 2 days earlier. Proof, deliberate and unmistakable, that they had been watching her for longer than the bomb threat had suggested. Written on the back, in a hand Ji-hoon would later confirm belonged to Baek Joon-ho himself, was a single line. "Everyone the winter line loves eventually becomes a liability. We are simply reminding you of the math." Kang Dae read it standing in the private dining room, and Min Hee watched something in him go very still in a way that frightened her more than his anger ever could. The specific stillness of a man calculating exactly how much he was willing to lose, and to whom. "They've been watching me," she said, reading the note over his shoulder. "Not the fund, not the business. Me specifically for days." "Yes," Kang Dae said. "What's the math they're referring to?" 11 years ago, Baek Joon-ho's father tried the same lesson on a different man in my position," Kang Dae said quietly. "He succeeded. The man is not alive anymore, and neither is the woman he loved. The Beck family has done this before. They know it works." Min Hee felt the cold of that settle into her chest, but underneath it, something harder and more certain than fear. "Then we don't let it work this time," she said. "You didn't survive 11 years in this world by following someone else's math, Kang Dae. Whatever happens next, I'm not disappearing quietly so you can keep me safe from a distance. We do this the way we've done everything else since that stairwell, together or not at all." Kang Dae looked at her for a long moment, the photograph still in his hand, the weight of 11 years of ruthless caution warring visibly against something newer and far less controllable. "There's a plan," he finally said. "One that ends this properly, not with a threat answered by another threat, but with the Beck family unable to ever make this move again. It's dangerous. It requires you to trust me with something I haven't told even Ji-hoon yet." "Tell me," Min Hee said. "Not tonight," Kang Dae said, and for the first time she saw him afraid. Not of the Beck family, not of losing his empire, but of what it would mean to finally let her all the way into the part of his life he'd spent 11 years keeping separate from everything good. "Tonight, I need you somewhere safe, and I need to know you'll still be here in the morning to hear the rest of it." "I will be," Min Hee said. "I've never once given up on someone worth staying for. You, of all people, should already know that. And that's the cliffhanger, Soul Sauce family, I know. But this is exactly why part 2 exists. Comment Beck family below if you want the full war, the full plan, and the ending this couple deserves. Subscribe now so you don't miss the moment it drops. This is one of the biggest stories we've ever built, and you're getting it first. Some nights, Min Hee still thinks about the woman she was on those concrete steps. Soaked, unemployed, splitting her last meal with a stranger because it was the only thing left in her power to control. She didn't know that night that she was being watched by a man who had spent 11 years building walls specifically so no one could ever again make him feel the way watching her made him feel. Exposed, moved, reminded of something he thought his empire had erased. She didn't know that mercy, offered without an audience, without expectation, without anything to gain, would become the exact thing that undid the coldest man in Seoul. She knows it now. She knows it every time she walks into the fund's small office and finds another folder waiting on her desk. Another Eugene, another version of a woman who believed, right up until the moment someone actually helped her, that no one with power would ever bother looking closely enough to care. She knows it every time Kang Dae appears in the doorway of Woobin House after service. Not because a rival needs handling or a debt needs collecting, but simply because 11 weeks of habit have taught him that the end of her shift is the best part of his day. She still doesn't know everything about him. She knows there are rooms in his empire she hasn't been shown yet, debts and enemies and decisions made in years before she existed to soften any of it. She knows the Beck family's photograph is still sitting in a drawer in his office, unanswered, a threat neither of them has spoken about since that morning, and she knows, with the specific dread of someone who has learned to read a room before it collapses, that whatever plan Kangdae is building to end it will cost both of them something before it's over. But she also knows this, that a man who spent 11 years making himself untouchable had looked at her, exactly once, giving away the only thing she had left, and decided that was worth becoming touchable for. That's not nothing. In a city built entirely on the currency of never needing anyone, that's the rarest thing there is. Somewhere above the city, in a tower with no photographs on the walls except two now, the undeveloped roll from his mother's room, finally printed and framed, and a new one added quietly to his office in the week after the fund's launch, a photograph of the two of them she hadn't even known he'd taken. Kangdae watches the city he built, no longer alone in it, and understands exactly what he almost let himself never have. He picks up his phone. Ji-hoon answers on the second ring. "The Beck family plan," Kangdae says. "We move on it this week. Not to protect my empire. To protect the one part of my life that was never supposed to be for sale." Outside, the November rain has finally stopped. Somewhere below, on a set of concrete steps that started all of this, the wind has gone quiet for the first time in months. It won't stay quiet for long. But for tonight, it's enough. If you made it all the way to the end of this one, thank you. Genuinely, this is the longest story we've built yet, and every single one of you who watched to this point is the reason Soul Sauce keeps growing. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and drop a comment telling me one moment from tonight's story that stayed with you. Part 2, The Beck Family War, and Everything Kangdae Has Been Hiding is coming soon. I'll see you there.